Hi guys, welcome to another episode of Retro Hardware. Hope you guys like the new intro and theme song. So today's episode should actually be called Retro History because we're going to look at one of the darkest moments in the video game industry, the video game crash of 1983. The video game crash of 1983 affected the second generation of video game console systems, sometimes referred to as the early 8-bit era. And it's sometimes called the video game crash of 1984 because that's when actually its full effects were felt. Consoles which were a part of this generation included the Fairchild Channel F, the Atari 2600, Magnavox's Odyssey 2, the Intellivision, the Atari 5200, the Vectrex, the Emerson Arcadia 2001, the ColecoVision, and the Bally Astrocade. Phew. Needless to say, if you were a gamer in the late 70s and early 80s, you had plenty of console options. Maybe too many. During the early part of the 1980s, you saw a boom in the video game industry, with the arcade game industry reaching its peak in 1982, generating $8 billion from all the quarters that you would pop into those arcade machines. And that was $8 billion in 1982 dollars. Adjusted for inflation, that's equivalent of $18.5 billion in today's money. Meanwhile, the home console industry was earning just under half that amount of the arcades, at about $3.8 billion in 1982 dollars. That's a pretty big difference when it's completely different today, as arcades are a relatively small factor when compared to the home and PC gaming markets. But back in the early 80s, before you had the internet, XBLA, PSN, or Steam, if you actually wanted to play co-op or versus with someone, you had to go to an arcade. If any of you guys have seen the original Tron film and remember Flynn's Arcade, those were the hotspots for gaming back in the early 80s. Arcades brought in more revenue than the pop music and the movie industry. So that's like the arcade in your mall, making more money than the Avengers movie or the latest Rihanna album. Needless to say, many companies wanted a piece of the pie and entered into the home console market. In addition to the aforementioned consoles, there were also a bunch of clone consoles from Sears and Radio Shack, which could play Atari and Intellivision games. This created a glut of consoles in the marketplace, leading to one of the major reasons of the video game crash. And with a lot of consoles came a lot of games. This created multiple problems. First, if you were a consumer, in addition to being confused by all the consoles being available to you, you were also confused by which version of the game to get. Atari not only made games for its own systems, but it would also make games for its competition. Again, this was before the time of the internet, and even before gaming news really, so you couldn't really check out any reviews of the games in advance. And perhaps because of the lack of a strong public review forum, one of the most egregious mistakes that the video game companies did at the time, namely Atari, was release horrendous software. Hey, Atari, it's called quality control. Look it up. Two of the most famous examples of Atari's lack of quality control were their port of Pac-Man and the E.T. video game. Let's talk about Pac-Man since it first came out in 1982. Pac-Man had been a huge hit in the arcade, so Atari rushed, and the key word here is rushed, development of a port of the game for the Atari 2600 system. Development took around 6 months total, with programming around 6 weeks of that time. Although the Atari 2600 was getting outdated at the time, hardware wasn't the reason why this port was so bad, because it actually was able to do a much better port of Pac-Man's sequel, Miss Pac-Man. No, the port of Pac-Man was a tale of greed and hubris by Atari. The port was quickly rushed, as Atari thought gamers wouldn't care about the poor graphics and sound, as they thought it was the gameplay that made Pac-Man, Pac-Man. In addition, they were so confident about Pac-Man's sales that they ordered 12 million copies of Pac-Man, despite the fact that there were only 10 million Atari 2600 units sold at that time. Atari thought Pac-Man was going to be a killer app and system seller. Instead, although Pac-Man was the best-selling 2600 game, it sold only 7 million copies, leaving Atari with 5 million leftover copies and a lot of consumer dissatisfaction. E.T. was a movie tie-in game to the Steven Spielberg blockbuster, E.T. the Extraterrestrial. At the time of the movie release, E.T. was the highest-grossing film of all time, surpassing the box office gross of the original Star Wars. Atari, smelling green, paid a whopping $20 to $25 million for the licensing rights. The big problem was that this deal was completed late in the summer of 1982, and Atari wanted the E.T. game to come out before the Christmas shopping season. So apparently learning nothing from the Pac-Man fiasco, Atari rushed through the development and production of the E.T. game, creating one of the worst video games of all time, and starting the dubious trend of bad video games based on movie tie-ins. And much like Pac-Man, E.T. did not meet sales expectations. Between 4 and 5 million copies were shipped to retailers, and only around 500,000 to a million copies were sold, leaving Atari with yet again a bunch of unused, unsold cartridges. And supposedly Atari had to send a fleet of trucks down to New Mexico to dump all these cartridges in a landfill. So let this be a lesson: a rushed product is usually a crappy product. Other contributing factors to the video game crash was the fact that Atari did not allow the designers and programmers to be credited in their games. This naturally pissed off a lot of their employees, some of whom left the company to form Activision. Atari tried to sue Activision to stop the sale of their products, but Activision won. This opened the door for third-party companies to jump on the video game bandwagon. And unfortunately, you had a lot of companies make video games who really had no business making video games. You had Quaker Oats, which opened a video game division. Yeah, Quaker Oats, the maker of that oatmeal you ate for breakfast today. You also had companies like Kool-Aid make games like the Kool-Aid Man. Even Purina, makers of dog and cat food, made a game like Chase the Chuck Wagon, about, yep, dogs eating food. Man, I hate branded entertainment. Now if you excuse me while I take a bite out of this delicious new Doritos taco I got from Taco Bell. So you ended up having a market saturated with video game consoles and crappy video games with no control over third-party titles. And faster than LeBron James could say contraction, video game revenue fell from $3.2 billion in 1983 to around $100 million in 1985. Atari was hit the hardest, but also hurt Coleco and Mattel. A couple things to note before we end this episode. During the time that the market was getting flooded with these consoles, personal computers like the Commodore 64 and Apple II were becoming competitive with the relatively low prices. And these computers were very gaming friendly. The biggest effect of the video game crash of 1983 is that it opened the door for a former playing card company to virtually take over the industry in a few years with one of the greatest video game consoles ever. And that company was Nintendo, with the Nintendo Entertainment System. It also marked the shift from US designed and development systems to those that would be created in Japan. Okay, that's all the time we have for today. Hope you guys enjoyed the episode, and let's remember all the lessons from this last video game crash so that we can avoid another one. Now, where's that taco? Happy collecting.